So go to Isaiah. We've already finished chapter 2, but I'm going to start by reading the last verses of chapter 2. And I said it in my prayer. I want to say it again. I never have taught through Isaiah like we're doing here, and it's going to take us obviously many, many months to get through it all. But I have been struck with, and this text today, you'll see not just the seriousness of it, but how relevant it really is to our world, not just loosely relevant. I mean, it speaks to us today and the culture that we find ourselves in. And um, I don't want to over dramatize, and I don't think I am. When I read this and it talks about a remnant, I really believe that the true people of God today are that remnant, that the minority in a world that has kind of gone awry. So I want to begin in chapter 2. I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to really comment on it. Beginning in verse 12, and I'm going to read through the end of the chapter. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low, upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan, upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, upon every high tower, and upon every fortified wall, upon all the ships of Tarshish, upon all the beautiful sloops. The loftiness of man shall be bowed down, the haughtiness of men shall be brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. But the idols he shall utterly abolish, and they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. In that day a man will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each for himself to worship, to the moles and the bats. They'll throw them to the moles and the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the crags of the rugged rocks, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. And then in verse 22, sever yourselves from such a man whose breath is in his nostrils, for what account is he? And what chapter 2, the end of chapter 2 is doing, Isaiah is proclaiming the horrifying day of the Lord that is coming. And it would be a divine response, a response of God to the wickedness of his people, the people of Judah. And God is saying, there is a day coming that I will not tolerate this any longer. And when I have reached that point, my judgment is going to come. And the idols that you made, you're going to throw them away. You're going to go hide in the holes. Revelation talks about this. They hide in the caves and they say, protect us from the wrath of the Lamb. It's a picture not only of what happened to Judah in 586 when Babylon came in, but it's also a futuristic picture of the judgment of God that will come someday when the wickedness has gotten to the point where God says no more and he's going to judge. So the wicked are described in this text as casting away their idols. They run to the caves, into the clefts of the rock, to escape the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. This section, then, that we're going to look at today continues that theme, specifically the theme of how foolish it is to trust ourselves, to trust our idols, to trust our wisdom, to trust our ingenuity, and in doing that, failing to trust the Lord. I won't go into a long conversation here, and I'm not an expert on it at all. I've done some reading on it, especially recently. Somebody asked me this morning or not this morning, Sunday morning, if the whole artificial intelligence thing might be sort of a 21st century Tower of Babel. Look what we can do. Look how wise and smart we are, and look how we can create new life and create human mind centers. And I don't think that is a stretch at all. This is, if nothing else, it is clearly an example of humanity thinking that we have outsmarted God. And that's what idols are. That's what they did then. That's what we do now. But there will be a day that all of those things will be worthless. That's what happened to them. It's what will happen to our world, because when God finally says enough is enough, no human intelligence, ingenuity, wisdom, skill, talent will be able to stand the wrath of God. So it is a significant and relevant warning to us as well. So 4 little subsections we're going to look at this morning, and it'll move rather rapidly, as I mentioned. We're going to begin with kind of just setting the context pretty quickly, the first 12 verses, the context of 2 more oracles. Remember, oracles are just simply prophecies. They're just God is speaking. There's 2 of those in this section. First 12 verses will set the stage for that. Then there'll be Oracle 1, and then there'll be Oracle 2. And then the last section just amplifies and explains the second oracle a little bit more. So let's jump right in and set the context for what's going on in Judah as God will make these proclamations. And he begins by promising a famine that is going to come, but the famine is going to come because the enemy is going to besiege them. All right. And the enemy, let me just put these dates up again. Isaiah's writing in the 700s, all right, BC. And in 722, Israel will fall to Assyria. And Isaiah's prophesying before this happens. And in 586, Judah will fall, and they will fall to Babylon. You just need to know that. He is prophesying about the day of the Lord that will happen for both of these nations, but it also references what will happen in the end times as well. So it's kind of a dual prophecy. All right. So he is prophesying that there will be a famine that will be a result of the siege of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Specifically, he's speaking to Judah, but Israel is also God's people, even though they've wandered further. So they're hearing it as well. Look at verse 1. For behold, the Lord of hosts, takes away from Jerusalem, that's the capital city, and from Judah, notice what he takes away: the stock and the store, the whole supply of bread, and the whole supply of water. That's just a promise that famine is going to come. A couple of things that are interesting here. Notice in verse 1, he says, the Lord and the Lord of hosts. The Lord is, Hebrew phrase is Ha-Adon or Adon. So we get Adonai, Ha-Adon, and that means the sovereign one. And then the Lord of hosts is Jehovah, where we also get sometimes Yahweh. But this is the covenant name of God with his own people. So he is saying, the Lord, the sovereign God and the covenant God with you, is making this declaration. So that's why both titles are being used. He's not only sovereign over history, but he reigns over the orchestration of nations and the powers and judgment on his own people is under his control because he is their covenant God. He says he's going to get rid of the stock and the store, that is Masain and Masenah, and stock is Masain. That means all the supplies that sustain them, the bread and the water. The word store is Masaneh or Masanah, and that is kind of the backbone of the supporting structure of the nation. So I'm going to get rid of all the supplies, all the resources, and the infrastructure that holds that up. I mean, you could see that as a collapse of government systems that distribute the food and a loss of food. I mean, that's the kind you're going to, because the Babylonians are going to attack you, there's going to be a famine, but it's not just going to be a problem with food. There's not even going to be distribution methods, because I am bringing my judgment on my people. Verse 2 and 3, really interesting verses. The mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder, the captain of 50 and the honorable man, the counselor and the skillful artisan and the expert enchanter. Notice that verse 2 and 3 is coming from that phrase in verse 1, the Lord of hosts, I take away from Jerusalem and Judah. So in other words, not only is the food going to go, not only is the infrastructure going to go, but look at that list of leaders. Mighty man, man of war, judge, prophet, diviner, elder, captain, the honorable man, the counselor, the skillful artisan, the expert, and the enchanter. I put a list on the bottom of page 1. Military and warrior, gone. Judge and prophet, gone. Even the diviner or the elder, the people they normally would go to for advice, gone. The counselor and the craftsman, even the expert and the enchanter, all of the normal, or all the customary sources of guidance would be removed because of their rebellion. You're going to lose not only food, not only infrastructure, but your mighty men are going to be devastated. Your counselors are going to be devastated. All of it, this is part of the judgment of God. It is going to be devastation to the people of God. The word enchanter, and all that's happening because of the rebellion, the word enchanter actually speaks of a snake charmer, and pagan nations had used that, and Israel had already become so pagan that Israel was involved in the snake charming, and Judah was starting to be involved. Again, think about this. God is saying all these things you've trusted, they're going to be gone. There's going to be devastation that's going to come to them. Now, I'm going to have you hold your finger in Isaiah, and I want you to turn back to 2 Kings 24 and kind of give you an example. This is warfare in the ancient world. This is how warfare took place. Look at 2 Kings 24. And I find this really interesting, and I'm going to make an application that you'll completely get. Look at 24:13. He's talking about when Babylon came in. He carried out from there, verse 13, all the treasures of the houses of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. And he cut in pieces all the articles of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. Also, he carried into captivity all of Jerusalem, all the captains, all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiachin, captive to Babylon, king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, the mighty of the land. And he carried into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon all the valiant men, 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths, 1,000, all who were strong and fit for war. These the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. The king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. 2 Kings 24 is speaking of the time after Isaiah prophesied. So that's what happened. Babylon came in. They demolished the infrastructure. Obviously, they burned the fields, so there was no food. and they took captive all of the skilled people. That's how, this is the part you'll all remember, that's how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ended up in Babylon. They were the wise men. They were the up-and-coming leaders. And so as Babylon went in, they said, let's get all the smart guys. Let's get all, the people of wisdom, the counselors. Let's get the doctors. Let's get everybody, the craftsmen. We want to use them in Babylon. They carried them away captive, and the only people they left were the poor and the weak. And so what Isaiah now is prophesying, this is what's going to happen. And indeed, it did happen in 2 Kings 24. So when Assyria and Babylon would besiege a people, they would remove anything that might be a threat to their power. This is what is going to happen, is what is being prophesied, and indeed, it did happen. Now, go to verse 4 and 5. This kind of societal collapse obviously will bring widespread, and did bring widespread, confusion. And I will give children, look at this, to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. The people will be oppressed, everyone by another, and everyone by his neighbor. The child will be insolent toward the elder, and the base toward the honorable. There will be, Paul Winger says that there was going to be, the prophecy was that there was going to be a topsy-turvy society. When you take the leadership away, you pummel the land. The Babylonians would eventually bring Isaiah's prophecy to pass. But Isaiah already saw it coming. He saw this is what's happening in our culture. This is happening in our society. Babylon would only finish off what Assyria had already started by corrupting people with their idolatry. What's really interesting about verse 4 and 5, notice those unsuited for leadership would become their leaders. Look at verse 4 again. I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. The people will be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child will be insolent toward the elder, and the base toward the honorable. So those unsuited for leadership would begin to rule over possibly the qualified. In that culture, one's age spoke of one's wisdom. So the metaphor is you have the unwise, the children are leading. A sense of anarchy would ensue. When you have childlike leaders leading, a sense of anarchy ensues. And notice in verse 5, the language that depicts the rat race or the dog-eat-dog world. It says everybody will be devoured by another, and a neighbor will devour another. Now, I don't mean this, I'm going to speak in a very broad stroke because I think it's accurate. Some of us remember days when people that were in leadership were people of decorum. They were people that do you all remember those days? There were days like that, seriously, where they were the grown-ups in the house. And I think all of us who have lived through the last 15, 20 years, and notwithstanding today, can say it'd be nice to have some adults running the place. Do you not feel that? And I'm just telling you, Scripture, that's why I say this, he's telling them, you've messed around long enough, and you're now going to experience what it feels like to have unskilled, unwise, immature people leading. And I think our nation over the last couple of decades is beginning to feel that. And again, you can agree or disagree, but we're seeing this very kind of, everybody does what they want to do. When there's no strong, godly leadership in the House, I'm talking about the House of Representatives, in the House, when they're not running the place, and there's a vacuum. Everybody's trying to do their own thing. That's dog eat dog world. You run over your neighbor, you run over your friend, and everybody's trying to get to the top because we first cast aside moral authority, and then moral authority became whatever you want it to be. And then immature people who one wants it to be this and one wants it to be this and I want it to be this. And we have a nation now, I would argue, is experiencing the beginning of the judgment of God, just like Judah was. You can take it or leave it, but I'm just telling you, this speaks to our day today. It'll even say more here in just a few moments. Look at verse 6 and 7. And it speaks to this very thing. Look how they recruit leaders. Just think. I won't even make any comment. It's hard, but I won't even make any comment. But just think, over the last many years, the kind of people that we're recruiting for leadership. Now look at verse 6 and 7. When a man takes hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, "You have clothing, you be our ruler." I mean, you at least have clothes. You see the lowering of standards? I don't care that you're not smart. I don't care that you don't have a clue what's going on. You got a set of clothes. So he grabs him and says, "You be our leader." All right? And let these ruins, you fix this mess. Let your ruins be under your power. And in that day, what's really interesting, there's the irony here, because in that day, he will protest, saying, "I cannot cure your ills, for in my house is neither food nor clothing. Do not make me a ruler of the people." So we're grabbing somebody saying, "Look, you got clothes. You can be a ruler." And he's saying, "I don't have clothes or food. Don't make me run this mess." This, again, you don't have to have much imagination. In fact, you have to have your imagination shut off to not see that this is the kind of thing that's been happening in our country for the last 20 years or so. This is precisely where we are at. So note the irony of verse 6 and 7. You have a cloak, you have the minimal qualifications, and notice his answer, "I have no resources." Remember, the leadership got driven out in verse 2 or 3. The Daniels, the Shadrachs, the Meshach, the Abednegos got driven out. So what's left are all the people that really have no leadership, certainly not godly leadership capability. Leadership's already been driven out. No seriousness regarding leadership. Notice the despair. You lead over this heap of ruins. There's an unwillingness to take responsibility. And so the unraveling of the culture is so clear for Judah. And again, I think speaks to our world. Verse 8 and 9, there's a collapse that cannot be recovered from. For Jerusalem stumbled and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. Verse 9 is really interesting. They look on their countenance, witnesses, the look on their countenance, witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They don't hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. There's a collapse that cannot be recovered from. Jerusalem stumbled, Judah is fallen. The picture is they've fallen headlong and they're still down in the picture. The holy city, Zion has fallen. They've collapsed. They're headlong. They're down. Their deeds are against God. They've provoked the eyes of his glory. Remember, we get to chapter 6. The glory of God is going to mean so much to Isaiah. And it's going to fill the temple. But they have despised the glory of God. They have mocked his holy presence. Verse 9, the look on their countenance. That word countenance is used only here, only place in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word is hakarat, and it's translated by some the look on their countenance. But it more likely, and you've heard me talk about this before, Um, karat, K-A-R-A-T, means to cut. You've heard me talk about berit, which is covenant. Karat berit, cut covenant. That's what a covenant in the Old Testament, they would cut animals. And so the word karat has to do with cutting. Many people believe, and I find myself here, I've looked several places, and I think this is a good argument. So more likely, this word hakarat derives from to cut, and it pictures not a facial expression, but it speaks of a cut on their face that would be a cut that they would make to appease Baal. Remember 1 Kings 18, when the prophets of Baal are on the mountain in this showdown with Elijah, and they are crying out all day, praying, trying to get their God to answer, and they start cutting themselves. Again, I don't want to stretch too far, but I will say, for those of you who know or don't know, I will say that it seems so bizarre to me, but one of the things that has really taken hold among young people in our culture is the cutting of themselves. And again, I'm not saying that they're worshiping Baal. I'm saying there's demonic behind that. And for whatever reason, they do that. I mean, it's, to me, the most bizarre thing in the world, but I mean, it's happening a lot. It's mainstream. Christian young people that are struggling with cutting themselves, I think just pictures the demonic that is behind that. And I think that word hakarat, the cut on your face, he's saying, shows us that you've already sold your soul. You've already given out to the enemy or to the wickedness. It reveals their rebellion and their sin against God. And again, with very little imagination, America, even church America, has sold themselves to materialism and to popularity and to position and to my kids being something. And we may not have a physical mark on our face, but we have sold ourselves to that philosophy, and all it does is scream rebelling against God. We are going to be our own gods, and we are going to control our own destiny. So God's going to judge that, he says. Verse 10, say to the right, but God's judgment, this is where I find it hopeful. God's judgment is not unbridled, but it is discriminating. Say to the righteous, it will be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for the reward of his hands shall be given him. So that's why I as long as I'm pastoring, we're gonna hold the fort and hold the ship. We're not gonna sell out, because God will bless that. God will bless the righteous. It may not look like it, and things may come down around us. I know people get worried about the economy and all of that. I'm naive enough to believe that God will take care of his righteous people. I just believe that. But the key is we've got to stay there. You can't have a foot in both and expect God to do that. And so we will not sell out or buy into the trends and the fads to mark our faces and try to appease a worldly system that God has already promised. Even though he hasn't judged it yet, God has promised he will judge it. Why would we want to connect ourselves to a system that God has promised he's going to bring down? See, to me, it's senseless. But the reason the church world does is the church world, for the most part, doesn't even know the Bible. And so they don't even know that's going to happen. And so they just follow the trends because it sounds Jesus-y. But Jesus-y is not enough. Jesus has to be Lord. And okay, that's really Sunday, not Wednesday kind of preaching, but it's true. And so he will judge. It's not unbridled, it's discriminating. Righteous and wicked are treated the same. Um, uh, Righteous and wicked are not treated the same. Noah was saved. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed, but Lot was saved. God is just and merciful, and he will protect the righteous, the remnant. All the way through Isaiah, there's a remnant, and we just want to make certain we're the remnant, all right, or part of that remnant. Verse 12 is kind of a summary. So as for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your paths. All of the wicked are culpable, but leadership bears the brunt. And by the way, James, remember, says, not many of you should want to be teachers, because with the words that you mete out, you'll be judged with those words. What I do think it suggests, again, just like children and women here are a metaphor for the unqualified in that culture, and that's what's left, because they take away the Daniels and the Shadrachs and the Meshachs and Abednego. So the inexperienced leadership is noted by the children and the women. And Athaliah, by the way, I think there's even a little prophetic pun here. Athaliah is the daughter of King Ahab, who is the king of Israel. Israel's about to fall. And Athaliah, you thought Ahab and Jezebel were bad. Athaliah was really bad, and she would lead Israel the rest of the way to their fallenness. And so you read about that in 2 Kings 11, 1 through 20. So God would use Assyria to just chasten Judah, to purify and cleanse the remnant, but they would ultimately fall. So we're in the 700s, and Assyria, we'll hear more about it in Isaiah, but Assyria is jumping over the borders, and they're taking land, and they're taking tax money from Judah. But then Assyria weakens, Babylon takes over Assyria, and in 586, it's Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon that will ultimately destroy Judah. So this is, for Judah, this is still some 120 years out that he's prophesying that this is about to come. Now, let's look at the first oracle, just 3 verses. Verse 13, the Lord stands up to plead, and he stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and his princes. For you have eaten up the vineyard, the plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor, saith the Lord God of hosts? So notice the oracle begins with, the Lord stands up to plead, and it ends with, thus saith the Lord. So you see why that's an oracle. It's a set aside prophecy. So the situation has been described in the first 12 verses. Now God stands up and he speaks judgment to the leaders who have so corruptly and irresponsibly performed their role. God now, look in verse 13, the Lord stands up to plead. He stands to judge the people. So the Lord he's the judge. The trial is now set, and it begins, and he is going to judge the leaders. The leaders, the princes, and the elders have used their power to exploit the very ones that they should have protected. Again, doesn't take a big imagination to see that leaders, even in our day, have abused their power to exploit the very people that they were supposed to have been protecting and helping. That is, again, it is when righteousness exalts a nation, and when a nation and its leadership is listening to God, that nation is blessed. But when God is used to get in the door, but God is not sought as Lord and King, and power goes to humans outside of God always abuse their power to extort the very people. You've heard, what's the word, the little phrase about power corrupting and complete power or whatever. corrupts completely. I'm not saying it exactly right, but you know what I mean? When someone, what's that? Absolute power corrupts or destroys absolutely. And that's exactly what happened to Judah. And again, I think we see that happening. And notice in verse, I read it in verse 14, you have eaten up the vineyard, the plunder of the poor. In chapter 5 and verse 7, Israel is called his vineyard. So it's kind of a look ahead, but you'll see that as well. So God is clearly angry with abuse of power. This certainly references civil power, but with Israel and Judah, civil and religious. Keep in mind too, I think this is important. I remember writing this and thinking, I need to make sure that we hear that. We tend to separate, and our government does this, and separate religious and civil power. It was not separated with Israel and Judah. I mean, they were to be really a theocracy. They had a king, but they had kings and prophets in the house. And so we're not just talking about, that was just the government. The government was the religious leadership, and they had corrupted, and God was angry with that, and he is going to destroy, because to whom much is given, much is required. Then we go to verse 16 and 17, which is the second oracle. And again, moreover, the Lord says, that's the kind of the trigger. So now there's a second statement. Because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and they walk with outstretched necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, making a jingling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will uncover their secret parts. So the sin of the men is corrupt exploitation of those that they were to protect. But the women are also culpable because of their haughtiness. Look at some of the phrases. Outstretched necks when they walk. That's phrase that means they are walking to be seen and to impress. Wanton eyes. The Hebrew is mescarat. It's used only here, but it means to flirt or to seduce. Walking and mincing as they go. It describes the strutting and the swaying of one's hips, the making a jingling with their feet. What this whole picture is, it is clear they are using their looks to draw attention and to find influence. Again, very little imagination needed. Our culture is so sexualized, and we think about, you get the merging of exploitive power with sex, and you get things like Jeffrey Epstein that obviously, again, I'm not even trying to be, this is just our world now. I don't know why we don't just recognize the world, and some that we may have trusted 20, 30, 40-year power that is not submitted to the lordship of Christ will go the way of the world. And the world has become sexualized, horribly sexualized, and you mix sexualized lust with authority, power, and money, and you get what they got, you get what we have. That's just where we're at. And this is maybe easy for me to say because now I'm a grandparent, but dense parents that don't see their kids are being sucked right up into it, they just don't get it. And it's usually too late when they do get it. And that's what we are battling against. That's why you have to hold the fort and say, no, we're going to disciple kids the right way. And again, I'm pretty passionate about this because Isaiah is not just some 2,700-year-old book. It's a book that's speaking to our culture today. Both of these, men and women, are driven by lust for wealth and power, and God says, I'm judging them both. The judgment will strike, notice the women, it'll strike their hair, and it will undo their extravagance. A scab on their, strike with a scab, the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion who are walking around strutting their stuff. And God said, I'll show you. I'll make that idol come down. This is clearly a rebuke of the lust for wealth and power and sex, which destroy a culture and what challenged Judah then and challenges us today. Jack Kemp is dead. Some of you remember Jack Kemp as an athlete, but he was also a politician. This is a powerful statement. People obey the law for one of two reasons. They either love God or they fear punishment. When both of these break down, the result is an environment that breeds violence, poverty, and anarchy. People quit fearing God and they quit fearing punishment. And what do you have? You have a mess like Judah had and a mess like our culture has today. Everybody see that? It's not rocket science. It's just truth. Now we move on to the amplification of Oracle 2 and a closing. Verse begins in verse 18. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery, the jingling anklets, the scarves and the crescents, the pendants and bracelets and the veils, the headdresses, the leg ornaments and the headbands, the perfume boxes, the charms and the rings, the nose jewels, the festal apparel and the mantles, the outer garments, the purses, the mirrors, the fine linens and the turbans and the robes. And so it shall be, instead of a sweet smell, there will be a stench. Instead of a sash, there'll be a rope. Instead of a well-set hair, there'll be baldness. Some of us have already been judged by God, all right? Instead of a rich robe, a girding of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. Your men will fall by the sword, and your mighty in the war. So I'm going to stop there for just a moment. So that the whole point here, it's not hard to understand. That which was cherished, which was used for wickedness, verses 18 through 24, God is going to destroy. To make that point, there are 5 reversals in verse 24. That which used to smell good now stinks. Fragrance becomes stench. That which used to be fancy, belt, turns into a rope. Fine hair turns to baldness. Fine clothing to sackcloth. From beauty to branding. In other words, from beauty, look at me, to being branded and humiliated as a slave in Babylon. You thought you were free in all of your lust and your arrogance. You're not free. You're now a slave. That's what God promises for judgment. Verse 25, men and women are responsible together. Your men will fall by the sword, and your mighty in the war. Her gates shall lament and mourn, and she, being desolate, shall sit on the ground. So your men, speaking to the daughters of Zion, indicates that they were married. These men have been rich because they have decked out their wives, but the men are corrupt and the women are pretentious or ostentatious. Both are driven by the love of wealth. That's power then and now. And the men will fall by the sword. Verse 26 shows complete destruction. Her gates shall lament and mourn, speaking of the women, and she, being desolate, shall sit on the ground. Let me explain the picture. Her gates, probably Zion's gates, are normally where the men would gather. Well, let me explain. I get coffee often at Burger King early in the morning, and when I drive around, I see some of our men and other men hanging out in Burger King drinking coffee. It used to be Arby's. Now Arby's followed the Antichrist and doesn't serve coffee anymore. So I guess that's what it was. But they hang out at Burger King. You can find groups of men hanging out at McDonald's. You can find groups of men hanging out at 12th Street Cafe. The gates of the city were where the men would hang out, all right? And they would tell the same story, just like they do now, tell the same story over and over, but it got a little bit bigger. Okay, that's what this picture is. But now the men aren't there. But instead, the women are desolate, and they sit on the ground. and they're weeping. Normally, the men would gather at the gates, but they have been destroyed. And so the women gather and they weep over their loss. It's just a picture of complete devastation. And there's one more verse that I think actually has significance that's maybe greater than we realize. And in that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own food and we will wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by your name to take away our reproach. You know what that picture is? This is why I love Bible study, because, and maybe everybody understood it, but I'm guessing most of us read through that in our devotions and it doesn't really make sense. So let's move on. Here's the picture. The men are so completely devastated. So many killed. The Shadrachs, Meshachs, Abednego's, Daniel's taken back. And so there's not this balance between men and women. There's not one man for every woman. And so 7 women will go after one man. And they will say, normally the man would have to, he'd have to, work the field and get the food and buy the clothing. And 7 women say to one man, we will fight for you. And the normal standards of you taking, you don't even have to take care of us. Just let us be called by your name so that we can have a child that's called by your name and remove the reproach on us for being childless. That's how devastated that culture is. Can I make an application here? Again, I know we're grandparents in this room, most of us. But our culture for many years has been feminizing the male culture. And we have, this is not raw men. There is a lack of godly men. And we have, one of the things Charlie Kirk was telling people, get married, have children, build families. That's God's way. Command in the garden, be fruitful and multiply. Not saying if you don't, anything wrong. That's not the point. But our culture is putting that down. The whole notion of that is being put down by this culture. And that's where we find ourselves today. And sometimes young ladies settle for far less than God's best because there is such a dearth of godly men. That's part of the judgment on the culture of Judah. And I would suggest to you, it's part of the judgment of any culture that puts God away and says we're going to go after our own idols and our own stuff. It may seem fun and exciting and erotic until you're devastated and don't have the earrings and you don't have the headdresses. And you're saying, we'll let down the normal standard. Just marry us so we can have a kid. I'm telling you, this speaks to our culture today. God is no respecter of persons. Both men and women will be judged for their wickedness and ill-placed longings. Let me just end with a couple of things that I wrote and a couple of quotes. This passage is strong, it's tough, but it's straightforward. God will not forever tolerate pride and rebellion, and he will one day put it down through judgment. Christopher Ash wrote, and the final proof that righteousness pays will not come until the final judgment, when the disruption will be put right and the creation reordered as it ought to be. There's a lot of Christians that are becoming weary and well-doing because I'm trying to be righteous, I'm trying to be holy, I'm trying to be faithful. And even people I used to be close to are running away from this. But we have to be faithful. The joy set before us. We have to say, this is the way we're going to go. And we're going to trust God. And we know that someday he'll put everything right. This is a call to humility. But what does that mean? Too often we think of humility as feeling bad about yourself, or at least pretending to. Thus, we have the common phrase, false humility. But in fact, that is not what humility is at all, as this passage in Isaiah makes clear. This, by the way, is John Oswalt. The opposite of self-exaltation is not self-denigration. Too often that's simply an attempt to garner sympathy for oneself, an attempt to get others to say good things about us. No, true humility is to refuse to put oneself in the place of God. It is to know oneself as a child of God, to know one's place in God's economy, and to know one's worth in His sight. Knowing these, it is possible not to need to call attention to oneself. That is true humility. It's not self-denigration, it's self-forgetfulness. I want Jesus to be Lord. I want Him to be exalted. So powerful, powerful stuff for us in Isaiah chapter 3. Before I pray, we will not, and I apologize for this. Obviously, we didn't plan on canceling last week, but the weather has been so poor, and we'll get moving and hopefully not stop anymore until the end of May. But we will not have Bible study next week. Several of us, um, I think all of the pastors and a few others are going to be at a conference. I'll be gone all week, and then they'll meet me and be there that second half of the week. But we will not have Bible study next Wednesday. All right, and we'll send out reminders, but then we'll pick back up the following week. So that's why, even though we had a little problem with the donuts, we wanted you to leave happy today with donuts. So, all right. Jesus, thank you for your word. And Lord, I've preached for 41 years, and more I'm finding how relevant your word is for today. And I pray, God, that you would never take that away, that I would always read it and say, oh my goodness, that's speaking to us today. And I pray that you'll help all of us to do that and not to be depressed about it. That's not because you've already said the righteous will be rewarded. But we don't want to be depressed about it, nor do we want to go and hide. We want to be diligent because we want to take a whole lot of people with us. We want to be stirred up about reaching our friends, our family members. The enemy's stirred up trying to get them and steal them and kill them and destroy them. We want to be just as stirred up so that we can reach them and win them, and they can enjoy the blessing of God in their lives as well. So allow the text not to frighten us, not to depress us, but to stir us up to be the people of God that you've called us to be. I thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen.